Today's speaker is Dr. Monica Toft. She's a professor of international politics and director of the Center for Strategic Studies at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. She's a colleague of Dr. Glenn, who was here this morning. Before coming to Tufts, Professor Toft taught at Oxford and Harvard. While at Harvard, she directed the Initiative on Religion and International Affairs, and she was the assistant director of the John and Allen Institute for Strategic Studies. She has a PhD from Chicago. Her books include Securing the Peace from Princeton University Press, Political Demography from Oxford University Press, and God's Century from Norton. She has affiliations at the University of Oxford and Harvard University. She's also a Global Scholar of the Peace, affiliated with the Global Peace Research Institute in Oslo, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She has been a Carnegie Foundation Scholar, a Fulbright Scholar, and most recently a World Politics Fellow at Princeton University.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. My husband taught at Wellesley for a number of years, so it brings me back. This is a great place, and I have to tell you women, he's taught at Chicago, Harvard, Oxford, and BU, and he thinks the Wellesley women are the smartest best prepared students he had ever taught. We both have deep fondness. In fact, I was driving around, my children learned how to ride bicycles on this campus because I would come out here with our minivan. We don't have a minivan anymore. Our children are now teenagers. I would put their bikes in the back and we wait for him to finish teaching. And then I would be having the kids tootle around on bikes. But you guys are too young for that because that was a number of years ago. So I'm delighted to be here. As Luke said, Dr. Sheehan said, I am a professor at the Fletcher School. I'm actually a new professor there with Dr. Glennon. I was at the University of Oxford where I stood up a new school of public policy. So if any of you are thinking about doing public policy or getting a master's degree, consider it. It's an excellent degree. You learn about government and management. And prior to that, I was at the Kennedy School, which is the Harvard School of Public Policy. And now I'm at the Fletcher School. So I've always been at schools of public policy. I'm very concerned about public affairs, public management policy, right, and community, thinking about the nation, thinking about the global community as well. I'm trained as an international relations scholar. Are any of you international relations or political science? My faculty chairs were Stephen Walt and John Mearsheimer. So I had some pretty heavy hitters on my committee, and they hit me hard intellectually, which is why I've had a very good career. Prior to that, I went to the University of California, Santa Barbara. And prior to that, where I was a double major in political science and Slavic languages and literature, I served 4 years in the US Army, which I absolutely loved. I thought it was fantastic. I went in when I was 17. I joked that I was a child soldier. And it was during the height of the Cold War. And it was very, very exciting because the Soviet Union was sort of on its wax. It was, for those of us who are old enough to remember, there was a time where the Soviet Union was pretty formidable, but by the mid-1980s, it was struggling. And Reagan was in power, and he says, we're going to, push them to the ground. He thinks he did with Star Wars. Star Wars is making a little bit of a comeback, but, so is the Russian Federation. I absolutely loved my time in the service. It was not your typical path to getting to where I am today as a professor of international politics. But it just shows you, life is funny, and if you see some really interesting and intriguing opportunities, sometimes snatch them because they work out. And along the way, I met my husband, and we've been together, I cannot believe it, this year, 35 years. So had I not gotten in the Army, I would not have my husband and my beautiful children and the career that I have. All right, so I'm going to lecture. I do not mind being interrupted. I want to see this as an engagement, sort of a seminar style, and we're a small enough group to do that. And I don't have a clicker, do I, Luke? So I just work from the keyboard?
Yes.
Which I don't mind, it's fine. So what we're going to do is there's been a global resurgence of religion. When I started this work, it wasn't apparent. I think for you guys, it's now apparent that there has been a global resurgence of religion, but it was totally unexpected, right? Religion, I'll go through what the expectations, both in practical terms and policy terms among policymakers, but also within the academy, when people were thinking about theories of religion and the dying out of religion. And then I'm going to compare, like I said, populism with religion, because I've been thinking about this a lot more. I've been writing some pieces about why are we seeing white nativism today? Right? I'm a student of ethnicity and nationalism, religion, identity politics. And I've done a ton of work on religion, and now I'm really starting to think about populism. And I think, Luke, you saw my talk on populism, one of my talks at the Academy for Philosophy and Letters. So I've been thinking a lot about populism because there's some similarities, and I'll run through, but you can disagree with me, right? Because I'm still doing thinking on that. And then I'm just going to go through some of the implications and conclusions of some of the ideas that I'm putting forward. So there's some, you know, what secularism is the idea that you separate religion. It doesn't mean you get rid of religion, but you separate religion from public life, that it becomes a private matter. So when you think about secular societies, right, the idea is that religion is distinct, it's in a distinct realm from politics, right? And so there was this idea about secular suspicion. So in the modern era, the idea was that if you had religion, religion was going to be not part of your public persona. You were not going to pray at basketball games. You were not going to pray at football games, that kind of thing. Religion was supposed to sort of disappear, die out. And if those, and where, you know, it remained, it was going to start declining, right? And so people were saying, and I'm drawing on a really good friend of mine, Catherine Marshall, who ran the religion program for the World Bank, because the World Bank came to the realization that religion was dying out, and so they tapped Catherine, who had done some religious studies scholar at one point, and said, can you help us to understand religion? And so the idea, so she came up with this sort of, she had 3 Ds, I've added a 4th, but religion was disappearing. If it's not disappearing, it's declining at least. It's dictatorial, and what that means is that it's based in principles, really solid principles, and that those principles, if you deviate from them, that you were somehow not doing the right thing, that it had to dictate your behavior, and not only your behavior, but your beliefs, right? Who you are and what you think, right? And then it's divisive, that because it's dictatorial, you either, what's your first name again?
Melanie.
Melanie, and then?
Mandy.
Mandy. So Melanie and Mandy have to have the same viewpoint, and if they don't, they're divided. And that this was not only going to force them onto different sides, but it was going to become divisive, and that they were going to have to defend their different principles. So those were the predictions, right? That religion in the 40s, that it was going to disappear, and if it wasn't disappearing in all places, it was going to decline. It's dictatorial and it's divisive. And this, has anybody seen this before? This cover of Time? Do you know when this came out? What's your name again? Molly? Rose.
I don't know when it came out.
What do you think? When do you think the height of modernism was? The idea of modernization and modernism. Yeah. What's your name?
Oh, Casey.
Casey. Yeah.
Would it be around the fall of like the Soviet Union?
You could say that's the second era. No, it's the 1960s, right? So it's the end of World War II, right? And so you have scientific endeavors, right? We go to space. Technology is taking off. We actually have microchips being developed. So it's actually the 1960s. You could say the 89, that period with microtechnologies, perhaps that's the second one. But the first real period of modernization beyond industrialization of the 19th century is really the 1950s and the 1960s. And the idea was that science was going to influence, if not determine, our fate. And that God, this supernatural being, this supernatural power, these supernatural spirits, you may not be a one God, that God was dying or dead, that God was no longer a religion, I mean they're using God and religion here equally, was no longer going to be part of our life. Yeah, Rose.
Why do you think that there was such a difference between like the way that this was perceived in the end of like in the aftermath of World War I versus World War II?
Why do I think? I think it started after World War I, and I think World War II was sort of a continuation of World War II. I think it was really the scientific advance. And also that God sort of had let humanity down with the Holocaust, and that it was 2 world wars. And that if humanity, how could a God or gods allow for humanity to do this to themselves? And I think there was a real stepping back. But also I think the scientific modernization revolutions, people no longer, and I'm going to go through this, were relying on nature to help them to understand how their livelihoods are going to turn out. So think about it. People were moving from farms into cities. You no longer were determined, the seasons no longer determined your fate. You didn't have to worry about drought. If you were living in a place that droughts came, what did you do? You brought in water. Science figured out a way for you to get water to your crops, fertilizers to have bigger yields. Do you see? So I think it was World War I and I think it was a continuum, and the cataclysm of those two wars combined, plus the Holocaust, and the fact that they were global, it really caused people, particularly in the West, and I'm going to get into this, particularly to question whether God exists at all. If a God exists, is it a God worth worshiping? Right? Because look what it's done to humanity and to us. And then on top of that, you have this science coming forward and alleviating a lot of suffering. It actually did. You did have crops. Right? I do a lot of work on demography and Malthus, right? We were supposed, Malthus, Thomas Malthus predicted that we were going to have too many people on Earth and that the Earth was not going to be able to sustain populations. Well, guess what? Through science, we figured out how to feed, today, 7 billion people. And it's a distributional problem. Yes, there's still people starving and malnourished, but if we could figure out a proper distribution, we could probably feed everybody on the planet. It's a political problem, actually, a policy problem. But that's a good question. So it's sort of this continuation of these sort of force majeure ideas in the global community, but particularly in the West. So this cover comes out in 1967, right? And the premise of the article is, yeah, God is dead. Secularism is taking hold. People are no longer having faith. They don't need to go to church. They don't need to go to temple. They don't need to go to mosque, right, anymore. That faith is not part of their everyday life. And so there's theories that came out, and you guys study theories. There's political science, philosophy, economics, math in here. And modernization theory said, yes, God is dead. They used the theory to say, and I'll go through the different theories, whereas my co-authors and I, after we investigated this, to actually know, it's because of modernization in conjunction with democratization and globalization that actually led to a resurgence of faith, right? That actually brought religion back into the public square where it was absent before, right? Religion is talked about much more forcefully today in the United States than it was in the 1970s. You guys don't remember that? You were probably all born in, gosh, I can't even begin to guess, in the late 80s, early 90s, right? Late 90s. Oh yeah, it's 2019. Holy moly. You guys keep getting younger, right? Well, I teach all graduate students. So you guys are born in the late 90s, right? But if you had lived in the 1970s, we did not talk about our faith. If you wore a cross, you kept it hidden, right? You didn't put it out there for people to see what your faith was. Well, anyway, and so we trace it to the trends that modernization actually explains the resurgence in coordination with democratization and globalization. So modernization, and you guys can have these slides, so you don't have to take huge notes. But again, talking about that movement from rural, right, agrarian lifestyle, where the seasons are going to sort of determine your fate, right, to urban and industrial society, where you're working in factories, or you're working in modern environments where if you've hit the switch, the light can come on. You don't have to go to bed when the sun sets, right? That you can turn lights, that you have heating and that kind of thing. And also modern states, modern societies promised an end to war, so this is sort of this counter-reaction, disease, right, and poverty. And we're still fighting poverty, but we've made great strides against poverty today. There are a lot fewer people living impoverished. And critical here is that no longer would your individual fate be decided by where and to whom you were born, right? I'm Catholic. I see myself as a Catholic because I was born to Catholic parents, right? And most of you probably have some, maybe not, but if you have a faith tradition, it's usually coming from your parents. And then there's an expectation that you're going to marry somebody of your same faith. That is happening less and less often. Right? It's one of the reasons why the Jewish population is sort of dying out, because they have a double problem. One is there's not a lot of them, not a lot of Jews in the world. And in order to have Jewish children, do you know how you become a Jew? Through your mother. And what happens with intermarriage, right? So this is one of the reasons why Ivanka Trump became a Jew, so that her children would be Jewish. But not a lot of women are willing to do that if they're not born into the faith. If you ask me to do it, I say, no, I'm a Catholic, actually. I can't do that. I abide by those traditions. But I could change. Whereas in the old days, it was much more difficult. First of all, there was a lot more constraint because you were staying in your locality and living in your community, and chances are your community was of your faith tradition. So the family pressures of that, and then also the inability to move, right? So it was much more difficult. But now you can change it. In fact, people talk about the United States. Pew does a lot of surveys of Americans and their faith, and they talk about them being very promiscuous, right? That Americans can choose different faiths. Now, Americans tend to stay within the Christian tradition, so Catholic, Protestant, Methodist, Lutheran, Baptist, and there's a whole slew of them. There's a lot of different branches of Christianity, but you can choose which faith of that to be. Whereas in the old days, you couldn't. When I was getting married to my husband, my mother's first question to me was he baptized? Right? I don't know if your mothers or fathers would say that. And I said, yes, he was. And she goes, well, was he baptized Catholic? And I said, no, Methodist. And her reaction was, what the hell is that? Right? She didn't know it because she's Catholic. I mean, she understands what the Methodist faith is. But she was pretty upset because she's concerned that my children would not be raised Catholic. So that individual over groups, and now as individuals, we have much more freedom to sort of choose and select some of our identities. Not all of them. Some of them are harder than others. But religion is one of the ones that you can choose. And then religious, cultural, linguistic traditions become less important. And critically, secularization, that if you do stay religious, it's private matter for you, right? That you're not going to have to express it, or you don't desire expressing it as much. So if you ask people, like I said, this is mainly a Western issue. So secularization theory and modernization theory, these are Western theories coming out of the Western academies. So Britain, France, to some extent Germany, and then the American academies, right? And so if you go and you ask people, this is a poll from 2002. They have not done an updated one about how important is religion in your life. And you can see in the UK, only 1/3, right? I think it's very important. And you can go all the way down, Bulgaria, Russia, the Czech Republic. The communists did a pretty good job, right? These were atheistic regimes. Anybody studying communism, Marxism here, Engels, right? They believe in atheism, right? There's no God, right? Well, anyway, they did a pretty good job pulling religion out of the culture in these societies. Do you guys see an outlier up there? The U.S. Right. So here's a theory, modernization and secularization theory, predicting that religion was going to die out. Except that, is the United States sort of a non-developed country? Is it a non-modern country? No. So how do you explain this very, very important outlier, right? But the theory predicts that religion. So it gets a lot, it seems to predict a lot for a number of countries, right? But even here, even these countries, when you add these two together, you still get a pretty significant number of people who still have a belief in, that religion is still important in their lives, even with these autocratic regimes that did not allow people to freely practice their faith. But there does seem to be some diminishment. And here you can see these are high-income countries, and you can see a decline in religiosity, whereas it was up to 85, 90% in the 1940s. So here's our post-World War II period rows, and then it's declining to it's about 72% by 2001, right? And so there does seem to decline. So the theory does seem to be predicting some of what's going on. And so a second question that people ask is it necessary to believe in God to be moral? So in the United States, for a long time, it was believed that you could not be elected to office if you were not religious, which is why our VPs and our presidents and our senators and our congresspeople, that they go to church and they want to be seen at church, because we are a deeply pious country. We're not only believing, but pious. We actually follow the tradition. That might be changing. We'll see. Your generation is coming up. But you can see that in large parts of the world that there is this deep sense that you need to believe in God to have a moral code. That's where you're going to get your morality, that there's somebody up there, some person, some spirits watching you, and that's going to help you, that your faith tradition, to do the right thing. Have you guys studied Plato and the Ring of Gyges, right? Who are our philosophers in here? So the Ring of Gyges. So God serves as that Ring of Gyges to correct our behavior, right? And so you can see in many parts of the world, I mean, look at Argentina, right? 99%. And then back up to the United States, 58%. So the critical thing is God is not dead, right? So that Time article was premature. So they were actually capturing sort of this 15-year period, but what I'd say was they were capturing it in Western societies. In most of the world, God was still alive, and I'll just run through. So the 1960s and 70s, and then the 1980s. In the 1960s, you understand, after World War II, there was this post-colonial period where colonial powers were giving up sovereignty over their possessions, right? And those countries, those leaders, many of whom were educated at places like this, Oxford, Cambridge, I see a Cambridge shirt, Harvard, right? And they were trained in, modern secular theories, right? Marxism, capitalism, liberalism. And they failed. So they take these theories, they put them into action, right? And their population said, yay, we've got a native, indigenous brother or sister running our country. And so for about a generation, they were willing to put up with bad government. But then after a certain period, they said, enough. You're not delivering schools, medicine, education, roads, jobs, right? And so in the 1960s, who was doing that in those countries if the government wasn't doing it?
The United States?
To some extent. The United States doesn't come in until the 1970s to really doing that forcefully. Religious authorities were doing it. Right? So you had a lot of missionaries, and you had a lot of churches, and you had a lot of religious organizations where the state was falling down. They were the ones delivering schools, hospitals, in some cases roads, right? They were the only sort of core feature in town, organizational feature, and they were delivering actually the services to the population. International aid doesn't come in till a little bit later, right? But the point is why does the United States have to go in? Because the states themselves were not doing the work that they should have been doing. Then we had the 1967 war. Anybody know about the 1967 war? This is Israel and the Middle East. And the big thing there is that Jerusalem fell out. Jerusalem ended up going into Jewish hands, right? And this created an uproar because people did not want that to happen. And it's contested among the Jewish community, the Muslim community, and the Christian community. And then within the Catholic Church, you had liberation theology, which was the idea that people have a responsibility to challenge authority if authority is not doing what it's supposed to do, which is a huge thing. Like you can't be this placid population. Right? That the idea that everybody, the poorest among us, deserve dignity and basic rights protected. And so liberation theology was all about the Catholic Church saying, we need to take care of the most vulnerable in society. And it ended up empowering a lot of lay people, bishops and clergy around the world to challenge state authority. And then you had the Iranian Revolution, which, was 1979, this was huge. Because here you had in the Middle East, a very strong country, so 67 we've got this Jerusalem being contested, and then the Iranian Revolution, you have a theocratic regime, right, a Muslim regime taking over a dominant state in the Middle East, in Iran. And it scared the heck out of Western societies. They're like, oh my gosh, we're going back to the dark ages, right? So that was, and it had started, the Iranian Revolution. Does anybody study the Iranian Revolution in here? It's a really interesting revolution if you want to do a paper or something on it. Because it started as a middle-class business, sort of, bazaari they call it, because they have markets and stuff, revolution that then the Ayatollahs ended up taking over. They ended up, coming and taking it over. And then implemented a theocratic regime, so a political system based on religion. And it's still in existence today. And then in the 1980s, the 1990s, John Paul II, I cannot underestimate the charisma and authority that this man had. And what he did was so he was Polish, which was really important. He talked about the end of communism, right? He's going around in the 1980s wagging his finger at all the communist regimes saying, you're not doing the right thing by your people. They need freedom. They need dignity. So you've got a son coming home from a Catholic church, right? Not another state, not the United States, not Germany, coming and saying you're not doing the right thing by your people. And then in Afghanistan, just like the Iranian Revolution scared the heck out of the West, you had global jihad. You had a bunch of students, talibs, right? Religious students, talibs. The Taliban defeat a great power. The Soviet Union. This is a state that has a nuclear arsenal that we're still dealing with today through the Russian Federation. And they were defeated by students. They were there for a decade, right? Gorbachev really tried to, win that war. They did not want to go in. They got pulled into that war in '79, and they stayed there for a decade, and they were defeated. And then you had the communist collapse, right? And then last you have the spread of democratization. And I'll show you some data on the spread of democratization. So there was a lot happening that was just sort of missed under the radar because everybody was thinking about the Cold War rivalry, the bipolar rivalry, and not thinking about ideas, not thinking about religion, and not thinking about non-great power states and what was happening in them and how they might help to change global politics, right? So when I was trained by Mearsheimer and Walt, they're all great power politics. All they care about, or Mearsheimer in particular, is who? Russia, the United States, China, perhaps Germany, France, and Britain. Although Britain, I hate to say, is not the power that it used to be. But that's it. And anything else is fuzzy. It's not going to influence global politics in the same profound way as great powers. And how are great powers defined? Population and GDP per capita. That's why we're nervous about China. Its GDP per capita is not there yet, but man, it's got population. And in the old days, that's what determined power. A critical question is that will that determine power coming into the 21st century? So it was missed. So these ideas, these dynamics on the ground, people didn't appreciate the profound global changes that they would wrought on the international system. So when you look about the global resurgence of religion, most of the world is becoming more religious, and it just turns out a really good friend of mine, Eric Kaufman, The Meek Shall Inherit the Earth. It's a terrific book. It turns out that religious adherents tend to have more children. And so if you look at, although most populations are declining, fertility rates are declining around the world, this is good for population, religious adherents actually are continuing to have large families. And so the number of people who believe in God continues to rise. But Europe and Japan, they remain outliers. The United States, by the way, is not an outlier. You saw some of the figures. The United States is a deeply believing, deeply pious country. So if you look at the religious adherents around the world, Roman Catholics are holding on to their own. But some people think that Roman Catholics, that number is inflated because once you get baptized into the Catholic tradition, you're still on the rolls, right? Whereas a lot of Catholics end up becoming Protestants of some form. And you can see Protestants are increasing, and this is largely what's really striking about this. The Protestants that are growing in number are not the Methodists, much to the chagrin of my mother, or the Lutherans. It's the Baptists and Evangelicals. It's people, so your first name again? Melanie. Melody or Melanie?
Melanie.
Melanie. Melanie can start a church on her own. She can buy a storefront or rent a storefront, and she can have her particular interpretation of the Bible, very individualistic, and she can have her flock. And that might grow to 100, to 1,000, to 10,000, to a mega church. So when you look at that growth of Protestantism, it's not the mainline Protestants that we think of traditionally. That's really sort of these much more individualistic style of Protestantism where people are having an individual relationship with God, which is a very modern idea, isn't it? It's really modern that I'm going to have, because Catholicism is all about having an intermediary. Who's there between you and God? The Pope. The Pope is sitting there. I can't get to heaven. If the Pope tells me I can't get to heaven, I have to, have him be my bishops and clergy, right? That's why I have to go and tell confession, right? So Luther comes along and says, no, you should have a personal relationship. That's what the Protestantism is all about, is that you have a direct line to God. And now it's become even more direct, where you're actually having individual experiences with God, right? The evangelical, that's what it's about. And so when you look, so it's completely consistent with the modern liberal era, right? So modernization, modern ideas have actually given rise to it. And then the Muslim communities growing at a quick pace. Hindu communities, this is mainly in India, of course, and then Buddhists. And Jews, the Jewish population is relatively flat. So generally speaking, you can see that the world population is still growing. Religious population is still growing. And if you look at the proportion of global atheists, declining actually. And there's one country behind this, and this is China. So China now allows people to say they can be religious, they're just not allowed to be Catholic. And you can't be like too big of a church, but you are allowed to declare your faith, in part because China has discovered, you guys know about the Protestant ethic and Weber, right? You work hard and you'll get rewarded. The Chinese government has noticed that people who are religious, actually, they're better fathers, they're better mothers, they're better workers. And similarly in Latin America, there's a really great book called The End of Machismo, that you get better fathers and husbands and boyfriends if men are pious and believing in God. They're not self-absorbed, narcissistic, that they're actually trying to do better. And so in the late 70s, early 80s, China allowed for people to say that they are no longer atheistic, and similarly in the post-Soviet space, and that's why you see a decline in atheists. All right, so causes of the global resurgence of religion. So modernization, it failed to deliver. The modern state failed to deliver goods and services. It just did, right? We still have poverty, we still have disease, and we still have war. You think about climate change today. I mean, this is a real failure of states on a global level. Democratization, it's promised to deliver. And then globalization, its capacity to deliver an upset, right? Because local cultures, local structures, local economies are being upset as people are coming in and ideas are coming in and goods are coming in, right? And competing with local environment. People can't compete. So 3 key aspects. I've already gone through this. I mean, the thing that I have not talked about is it created a backlash. Right? And so people were looking for alternatives. If the state's not doing this, who can help us? Right? Who can help to, alleviate our suffering, to make our lives better? And again, who's on the ground? Religious authorities. It turns out, if you look at international aid, the World Bank, Catherine calculated this, anywhere from 40 to 80% of every dollar that's given to the World Bank goes through religious authorities' hands. They're the ones on the ground, delivering goods and services. And so people turn to their faith communities, right? They were trusted authorities, right? If you look today, there's in this country, actually, the Catholic Church, in most countries now, the Catholic Church is no longer a trusted authority, but religious authorities are usually a trusted authority. And then modernization, science, communications, satellite phones, iPhones, right? Smartphones. It allows people to reach each other much more readily. So I showed you that slide before, but the point I want to make with it, showing it to you again, is yes, there's been a decline, right? But it's not disappearing, and that decline is not profound. It's still, this is the OECD, these are high-income countries, it's still up at 72%. That's still pretty high. Yeah.
Is there general consensus on what caused the shift from kind of a downward trajectory to a slight upward one?
Oh, what are you talking about? The
1981. Yeah, 1981 essentially.
No.
Like Reagan and the coincidence of the Republican Party with the religious.
The rise of the moral majority. It could be, except that this is all of these countries. Yeah. So Sweden, Netherlands, Australia. It could be. But the moral majority, you're right, they came about in the 1970s in response to Roe v. Wade. I mean, that really supercharged the Christian community in this country, was Roe v. Wade. And it could be a blip. But the point is that there's still pretty large numbers. There's more than a majority in across all these countries that still have a belief in God. And modernization theory is supposed to be telling us that no, it's supposed to be gone, right? All right, so that's one, modernization. The second is democratization. And it's really messy and divisive business. I think you guys can all see that with our government shutdown, right? Tomorrow's huge 2 votes, and we'll see what happens if our government remains shut down. We don't know. But it does open this space to different political views, and it allows religion to enter. And we see this in this country, the Supreme Court justices fights. It's really about whether you're pro-life or not, right, at this point, or pro-choice or not, right, however you want to frame it. And it legitimizes and delegitimizes new and old actors, and it privileges the proper role of faith in politics. And so you're from Turkey, right? Turkey is going through this right now. What is the proper role of faith in that society? It had been a very secular society, and now it's got faith is allowed in a bit more. Although some people challenge in Turkey because the government actually determines not the speech, in mosque on Friday. They actually give some of the speeches. So some people say that Turkey actually has less religious freedom than a place like the United States because the government so tightly controls Islam. But Islam is allowed to be more public today in Turkey than it was 2 decades ago. So yes, Rose.
Why was Roe v. Wade such a big turning point in the U.S., as opposed to maybe in Western Europe?
Because we're such a much more deeply religious country. I mean, it really comes down to that, and it got framed as a pro-life versus a pro-choice. And I have to tell you, so my mother was against capital punishment and against abortion. Why? Because God determines who and what lives. That is not for us to decide. That is God's decision. And so that's why, because it's about life, which God is supposed to give or to take. And Western European countries, much more liberal on this and not as religious. The United States is deeply religious. And so this got framed, and what's really striking is that it wasn't uniform across the Christian communities, like in Mormonism. Even today, some abortions are acceptable. But it was really the evangelical community in this country that grabbed this and said, okay, we're going to run with this. And now it's sort of become the defining one, if not one of the critical defining features of who gets admitted onto the Supreme Court today, right? All right, so if you look at the democratization, I don't know if you guys have seen this, Freedom House, if you guys are doing any reports or anything on democracy, you can see the blue is the good news is that the world is becoming more democratic, although we're seeing some backsliding. Again, we could talk about Hungary, Poland, Turkey, and the United States, by the way, has taken some dips back. All right, if you look at the Freedom House scores, and you can see that the not-free countries is declining. Right. The bad news is that these guys are upticking, so you're seeing democratic backsliding, some of these democracies becoming these. Why that's bad news is I'm a student of civil wars. These are the countries that are most apt to enter and get involved in civil wars. So the good news, we are seeing more democracies, and we're seeing fewer autocracies. The bad news, if you're concerned about conflict, these anocracies, we call them, these in-between states, if you're going to get a civil war, it's in those countries. So that makes us a little nervous. All right, so when you think about democracy, you tend not to think about religious actors, but it turns out that in most countries, religious actors are there at the forefront defending the rights of their fellow citizens. So I already talked about liberation theology. It really freed up Catholics to fight against autocratic regimes, particularly in Latin America. And if you look at democratization from 1970 forward, religious actors were involved in most of them. They were the ones out at the front saying, you need to open up the political system. So you look at East Germany, where did people gather and unite in order to fight the East German regime? In churches. That's where they united, and that's where they organized their protests, is they went to churches, because churches are sanctuary. People are already organized into communities, why China is a bit nervous about churches, because it's a hierarchy and it's organized. And religious actors were highly involved in these democratization efforts since 1972. So in 62% of the cases, we in our book say it is unlikely that you would have had any significant democratization in that country had there not been a religious actor in that country involved. But as you know, we're living in the era of terrorism and religiously inspired terrorism. Prior to the 1980s, we never saw religiously inspired terrorism. Isn't that interesting? It really is interesting. Why are we seeing it now? We saw class-based terrorism. We saw the Red Brigades. We saw leftist terrorism. We still see that today. And we see terrorism, right-wing terrorism. But we didn't see religiously inspired terrorism in the before the 1980s. And civil wars, religiously inspired civil wars, are much more common today than they were in the past. And they're much more deadly than non-religiously inspired civil wars. And again, it comes back to one of those Ds. They're divisive, and religions can be divisive, and they can be dictatorial because they force people to take sides. Melanie and I she's either going to be a Catholic, and I'm either going to be a Protestant. At one point, I was giving a talk in Ireland, in Belfast, which is still a divided city, right? This is a modern Western European country, and because of the Protestant Catholic fight there, they still have curfews, and you can go around and see the flags of the different communities. And I got in a taxi with a taxi driver, and his favorite joke is are you a Catholic or are you a Protestant? And he goes, well, I'm Muslim. And he goes, but are you a Protestant Muslim or are you a Catholic Muslim, right? There's really this idea you have to choose sides. And so religious civil wars, it turns out that they're on the rise. So religion is part of the fight, or the combatants see themselves on different sides based in religion. They tend to be more deadly against non-combatants, right? So there's this sense that anybody can be killed. It's kind of sad, right? That you can target markets, you can target cafes, restaurants. Muslim societies are involved in over 80% of all religious civil wars. And I don't want you to think that that's anything about Islam. It's because these societies are going through this democratization movement right now. So think about the Arab Spring. And I already told you, anocracies, those states in between, that they're coming out of autocracy. So they're moving out of that autocracy and they're much more likely to be involved in civil wars. And that's what explains why these Muslim societies are more engaged in civil wars, is they're trying to become democratic, right? And that's fraught with lots of challenges because political elites don't want to give up power. And so if you look at religious civil wars, it's a percentage of all civil wars. These are my own data. You can see where religion is central. So they're actually fighting over whether this state is going to have religion as part of its policy. So Iran and the theological revolution. And you can see religion central, it really ticks up. And here you go, the 1970s, and it just continues. There's a dip in the 1990s. Peace broke out. This is back to the end of the Cold War. And the negotiation of a lot of civil wars. We actually had an outbreak of negotiated settlements. That was great. But then after 2003 or so, you see an uptick again. And we're still living with them today. So you can think about Syria, where you have a religious tint to the civil war, Afghanistan, Yemen. Yemen is just horrific. It's really horrific, and in part because Yemen, the people cannot escape. They've blocked off the harbors, and they can't go north. And so the population, it's one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. So of the 25 ongoing civil wars at the end of 2014, this is where my data start, because you have to get, you backfill your data. Religion played a role in 76%. And peripheral just means that you have different faiths, you're on different sides, right? And then half and half peripheral. You're not fighting over tenets of religion to be policy. You just identify with different groups. So the Irish situation would be here, Afghanistan would be here, and it's sort of split. So again, they surged in the 1970s and again in the 2000s. They tend to last longer. The average civil war lasts about 7 years. The average religious civil war lasts about 9 years. They're harder to end by negotiated settlement, and again, sides tend to become very intractable. You're doing peace and negotiations here, you aren't you? Who's our peace? Oh, your peace stuff, right? So religion, it's really hard to negotiate these things. It's more difficult than non-religious. They're more deadly, and they're more deadly against non-combatants, and they're more likely to recur. So even if you succeed in bringing peace, the chances are they might break down. They have a higher probability of breaking. It's all probabilities and statistics, a higher probability of breaking down. Okay, I've already alluded to this, that religious civil war, religious terrorism is new. And you can see in 1980, only 4% of known international terrorist organizations had a religious tint. And by 2004, Bruce Hoffman has not updated his book. If you know him, if you read this book and like it, write him a letter and say, Bruce, can you please put out a new edition? Because it's a brilliant book. Well, anyway, 46%, it's almost half. And now I think it's even more, if you look at the data, has a religious tint. It's a small proportion are jihadists. So jihadists is Salafi Islamists, but they are growing. Now ISIS has been severely decapitated in the Middle East. It's still active. We just saw that in Syria with the 4 Americans who got killed. But you can see that they're fairly global, right? The only place they're not fully realized is in Latin America, although there are elements of it in Latin America only because they can get there and do some operational stuff. And you'll notice, I'm a student of the post-Soviet space, the Caucasus are missing from this data. This isn't my data. And global jihadi strategies, I mean, their strategy is to wage violence against the unfaithful in order to curry God's favor. That's what they're trying to do, right? They want to reawaken the Ummah. Do you know what the Ummah is? That's the community of fellow Muslims, fellow followers, right? To defend Islam and to defeat enemies. And there's 2 kinds of enemies. Do you know what an apostate is? And an infidel, right? An apostate is somebody who is a fellow believer who's gone astray. And in many faith traditions, apostates are worse than infidels, and infidels are people outside your faith tradition. And so if you look at the Salafi jihadists, they're going against both. Apostates, people who they think have fallen by the wayside, sinners within the tradition, or those who are absolutely outside of it. And their ultimate goal is to reestablish the caliphate, the Islamic State. And that's what ISIS did. So there's 2 variants, 2 larger variants today. Al-Qaeda, who is the original, and ISIS is an offshoot of it. And Al-Qaeda was much more patient and didn't think the time was right under Osama bin Laden and this guy Azzam, that they were not willing to declare the caliphate, whereas under Baghdadi, the ISIS organization, Islamic State, they declared the caliphate. And then they spread out, and remember they took the border out between Iraq and Syria, and they said that's an artificial construct that Western states, we're a state, they put that in, we're disavowing that. And so we've spent the last couple of years trying to defeat ISIS. But their ultimate goal is to reestablish the caliphate, to unite the Ummah, right, together, under their sovereignty, under their control. So Salafism is the idea of collective responsibility for the relative status of Islam, of the Islamic world, right? So why does the Pope travel? Because he has to go visit his church. Yes, he has St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and he's got the papal state, but the church is its members. Similarly, for Islam, the Ummah, that is the church, that is the community, right? That's what's important. So they see a responsibility of uniting them and protecting each other. So jihad in the 1960s got reinterpreted, again, 1960s, 1970s, really important time historically. They redefined jihad to not only be internal, sort of striving for perfection, but also going out and protecting that you have to go protect fellows. So jihad got this external element too. It was a redefinition under this guy Qutb in the 1960s. So Salafi jihad, you fight the near enemy. So Israel, the Jews, they should not be in the Middle East. They should be not part of the caliphate. Again, corrupt, sinful dictators, you go after the modern statesmen, right? They're not doing God's work. And then apostates, right? So these guys if they're fellow Muslims, they're apostates. If they're not fellow Muslims, they're infidels. So the United States and Saudi Arabia was seen as an infidel. Yeah.
Will apostate also cover different sects of Islam?
It depends. So you have to look at what they say. So right now in Syria, you have the Alawites, who they do not want to consider as fellow Muslims. The ones that are seen as really outside is Ahmadis. So the Ahmadis globally are sort of discriminated against, even though the Ahmadis identify themselves as fellow Muslims do not want to acknowledge them. So you have to look and see who they allow under their umbrella. So Sunnis and Shia recognize each other as fellow Muslims. They just believe in a different prophet, right, or different imam. Whereas the Ahmadi and the Alawites, there's a question. So you have to look to see. But the Ahmadis are one of the most discriminated against fellow Muslim groups. And then the global Salafi jihad, this is the one the United States is against, is you fight the far enemy. So there's the near enemy, that tends to be the dictators, the statesmen in state, and then there's the far enemy. And this was fairly new development. And Al-Qaeda under Osama bin Laden, this was his fight, right? Azam and he, so it was that organization was started by he and this guy Azam. Azam thought, no, keep it near. Right, let's fight the local enemy. Let's go after the Saudi kingdom. Right, they're the ones that don't have the true Islam. And Osama bin Laden said, no, we need to take it to them. And Azam ended up getting assassinated. Had he lived, maybe he could have compelled Osama bin Laden to keep it local. But Azam ended up getting assassinated. We don't know who did it. He had plenty of enemies. He was assassinated in Afghanistan. And so the fight ended up coming or being brought to the West. Yeah.
Would that also count, or I guess encapsulate the difference between like the Pakistani and the Afghani Taliban, and like how the Pakistani Taliban was a little more localized, I think, than the Afghani?
Yep. Okay. Yeah. So you want to look at their doctrine and their ideology, and who is it that they think is the enemy. And that's absolutely right. Although the Taliban in Afghanistan, it's only because the United States is there. Yeah. So they probably would not export it. If you look, it was Al-Qaeda. It wasn't the Taliban in Afghanistan that struck the United States. It was Al-Qaeda. And it was Al-Qaeda under Osama bin Laden. Because I would say that the Afghan Taliban is still largely here. The problem is they're willing to support guys who are here. And so that's why the United States in 2001, after 9/11, felt as if it had the right, of defense, right, in international law, to go and strike Afghanistan and the Taliban regime because they were harboring Al-Qaeda, which was committed to doing this and actually did this, right? That's why they struck the Pentagon and the World Trade Center and then some other. Do you have your hand up, Rose? No? Okay. Okay, so why is that doing that? All right, so if you look at the number of attacks, indeed, Salafi jihadists have been responsible, and it's increased over time. So these are our Salafi jihadists, and you can see there's Shia, there's national separatists, mainstream Islamist separatists, and then Salafi jihadists, and then Marxist nationalists. Very few of those. It's mainly these Salafi jihadists in the contemporary era. And this is my friend Asaf Moghadam's data. And then you look at people killed by terrorist attacks in Western Europe from 1970. And again, you see very little prior to the 1980s. And it's pretty interesting, right? Where did this come from, this idea? And I think it's coming out of those dynamics in the 1970s that I talked about. The theological revolution in Iran, which really it tried to be ecumenical. And what I mean by that, they were trying to appeal to not only Shia, their Shia society, but also the Sunni, to say we need to overthrow these really rapacious state dictators, right? And it inspired a lot of people to take up the mantle, right, in order to defeat. And so you start seeing blips of it, and then it really starts taking off in the 2000s. Okay, so you guys, for those of you who are interested in IR, political science, or philosophy actually, let's talk about Thomas Hobbes, right? Nasty, brutish, and short. What was he describing?
Human life.
What?
Human life.
Human life. Why is life nasty, politics and life nasty, brutish, and short? What era was he writing the Leviathan in? And why was he justifying the Leviathan? What was happening?
The English Civil War.
Yeah, English Civil War. So he's trying to figure out how to stop people from killing each other, hacking each other. And so he's writing the English Civil War. There's complete chaos and anarchy. And he's saying that life is nasty, brutish, and short. And the basic idea about Hobbes is, what do men fear most? What do men fear most? We'll see, Luke. What's the number? What do bourgeois men fear most? And women. I use that broadly.
Loss of status.
I think that's actually aristocratic. Bourgeois, I think you're right for aristocrats, which is why they supported dueling. But bourgeois, so Thomas Hobbes is trying to solve a societal political problem. What they fear most is death. So how do you stop people from fearing death? Is you have this Leviathan up there who has the sword, and then if anybody steps in a line, he can punish them. Right? That's what the Leviathan is about. It's installing and imposing order, right? And then you have to understand international relations theory is premised on the writings of Hobbes, not so much Rousseau. Rousseau, by the way, is, if you want to study somebody who's fantastic, I'm not that Hobbes is not fantastic, but Rousseau is fun because he's sort of schizophrenic. Because I don't know if you guys agree with that, but he really is. Yes, man's sociable, but you should still go get your own food. But in any event, so Hobbes, all these guys are trying to figure out what's the perfect order for men so that they still have freedom, right? But they can still live securely. They don't have to worry about walking out the front door of their house and getting clubbed and nobody having any punishment for that. So IR theorists end up taking these ideas and applying them to the global system of states, right? And so if you think of fear of death, right, on the human level, well, it's the same thing at the state level. Right? So if you think about deterrence theory, so states, the number one thing states don't want is for another state to come in and conquer them. So they try to deter them. How do they deter them? They build big armies. They form alliances, right? Because alliances you can call on your allies and say, help. You know, it's what happened in World War I, Rose, right? In fact, some people think that it was the alliance system that got us into World War I. It was too tight, right? Tightly coupled alliance system. How many times have you heard that? But the point is that the deterrence is premised on the idea that, what is your name again? Casey. Casey doesn't want to die. I don't want to die. Right? And so Thomas Hobbes, that's why he's erecting this, structures, and the Leviathan is going to ensure that we don't die. Now that he could kill us both, we hope is that you have a benevolent Leviathan. But the idea is that deterrence is premised on she and I not willing to kill each other, that we don't die. And so you can see it up there. Fear of death ends up becoming a central pillar of deterrence. It's a central pillar. If you read any IR theory and you think about actually, politics, and so it becomes the central pillar. And deterrence is premised on the certainty that the target, that your opponent, fears death above all else, right? So you think about the Soviet Union, what was the principle that we finally came to in the late 60s, early 70s? Who studied nuclear proliferation in this class? MAD. What is MAD about? What is MAD about? Mutually assured destruction. That we neither. Now we had some doubts along the way. We thought maybe the Soviets are willing to exchange men. So then we started thinking about, okay, then we'll take out their cities. Yeah, it'll kill some of their people, but they really care about infrastructure, right? So we had these things called counter-value, counter-target systems, right? And so, but the basic idea is we were pretty sure that they did not want to die as a society or a state. Yeah, you had your hand up, right? You're okay? All right, well anyway, so mutually assured destruction. Seriously, think of, so these ideas carry over. So for you philosophy majors, kudos to you, because they're really important grounded ideas that carry over in many principles of thought in different subject areas. And then fear of death becomes a key metric of rationality. If somebody's not afraid to die, right, do we think they're rational? No, when we started seeing suicide terrorists, people started interpreting they're irrational. And then people started saying, well, maybe they're just back to status. Who's their judge? If you're a suicide terrorist and you're doing God's work, God's your judge. God's going to be the so there was real concern. So when I would start to talk to policymakers in D.C. and what do you do with this? What do you do with people who do not have this basic conception that they don't fear death? How do we deter them? It's really hard. You have to either try to convert them and get them or persuade them that their ideas are not correct, or you may have to kill them before they kill you. That's the hard truth about this. And religious belief, it may, not always, but it may discount our feelings about physical life. And so that's what makes these opponents very difficult. And ISIS was sort of the culmination. I mean, it was really sort of an extreme version of this. In fact, they were so bad that Al-Qaeda kept sending notes and saying, stop. You know, at one point Al-Qaeda was beheading when it was in Iraq in the 2004s, 5s, and they were getting memos from people saying, you're pushing away followers. You're too brutal. And then ISIS was even more brutal. Okay, so that's religion on that side. So we've gone through modernization, democratization. Did you get me water, Luke?
I did not. I'll do that.
Would you mind? Or actually, is there just something right out the door?
There's some juice.
Yeah, I'll just grab it. All right, so we've gone through modernization, democratization, and just trying to understand how religious actors come into play in politics, right? And now globalization. This will be quick. And globalization is just the idea that ideas, goods, services, people can more readily move across borders, right? And it really took off. Now, some people want to say that the 1890s, anybody read Guns of August, Barbara Tuchman, very integrated world. You didn't even need a passport in Europe, right? But it's saying that, well, we were there before, that this is nothing new, except that the pace of it and the level of it actually is quite new. I'll show you a graphic in a second. But one of the key things is that religious actors, I already talked about the Pope, right? He's got to travel to see his community, to see his church. They're transnational actors. When Ayatollah Khomeini was trying to get followers, he was doing it from Paris. And he used cassette tapes that he would mail back to Tehran, right? Very effective. Here's communication. Now we have the internet, right? We have smartphones, digital technology that allows us to communicate. And transnational actors, they are religious actors, they're perfectly positioned to take advantage of these systems. And this is change in communications costs over time, and they drop precipitously in the 1970s, and then you have satellite phone coming on, so you could talk to anybody anywhere in the world. And so again, the 1970s is sort of a critical period for the global community. All right, so trends in relation to politics. So modernization in the development did not lead to secularization. If anything, it sort of supercharged religion and people's beliefs. Democratization allowed for religious voices to emerge and to be heard, and then globalization allowed for the efficient transmission of ideas and people. And the bottom line is that religious actors, so when I started studying this, many people wanted us to believe that the level of religion was here, right? And then it went like this. And what can you guys see over here? Colleagues and I are saying, no, actually the level of religion was like that and it's going like that. It wasn't down around 1. It's actually been at 10, or that religion was actually much more apparent than we realized. Okay, so religion is neither disappearing nor declining, and it can be dictatorial and divisive. When you're dealing with texts, when you're dealing with interpretations of text, there's no way getting around it. But the other thing is you want to keep in mind that, secular ideologies like Baathism, socialism in some variants of socialism, communism, Marxism, they were pretty brutal in this last century, right? It led to tens of, if not millions of deaths. So I don't think D's are a fair set of grades. And I think also you want to keep in mind that it's much more nuanced what the role of religion is in politics. It's much more nuanced than what you'll get in some interpretations. All right, so let's quickly go. Does anybody have any questions about that part, or because I don't want to just continually lecture at you. All right, so I just think it's fun since we're living in this populist era, all right, where people are rejecting sort of contemporary elites and the system. They're just rejecting. That's what populism is. Corruption of elites and the corruptions of corporate elites and political elites. And they want to toss out the system and they want to replace it with an outsider, right? The people want to rule, populism, right? They want to add somebody who represents the people. And populists are looking for somebody to blame for their travails, right? So they have a sense of resentment that what they're getting is not what they deserve, that they actually deserve more, and that the answer lies outside the current system. And this is a global phenomenon right now. It's happening in Italy, it's happening in Latin America, it's happened to some extent, Germany is being strengthened. Brexit. Brexit was a populist move, right? And the answer was that it's corrupt elites. So you want, and those elites could be political elites or they could be corporate elites, and we need to toss them out. And what's really striking is that's the same logic for Salafis, right? Salafis have the same thing, that it's sinful, corrupt elites, right? It's these apostates in our midst. We need to toss them out. It's really striking. I had never thought about that before I started putting together these slides for you guys today, just to give you, so you'll have great conversations at the dinner table. And then you look at so where are the resentments coming from? It's called the politics of comparison, right? So people are now in a position where they can compare how they're living their lives relative to others. And it really took off in the 70s, but particularly in the 1980s. And the VCR is one. I already talked about the cassette tapes with Khomeini, showing how people lived and that these people were not living the same standards. Despite the fact, in the case of the Soviet Union, was even worse because they were told that they had the best society on earth, right? That everything was the best. It was the best ice cream, the best TV shows. And then when you talk to Soviets who've left the country and gone to Germany or to the United States, and they say, you know, how tragic. You know, I thought I was always eating the best ice cream. And they start crying because they really believe that they were eating the best ice cream they could ever have, and they weren't. But similarly, the Arab Spring, right, where you have the youth of the Arab countries watching TV, YouTube videos, and say, why can't I have that? American movies, British movies, right? And wanting the same things. And where does everybody want to go? They want to go to the Western world, to Germany, to Europe. So the key to understanding the distribution is you have to look at who is gaining and who is losing. Right? And under populars, there's a core that feels as if it's being left behind. In some cases, they are. You can look at the data. I just finished a piece on white nativism, and it tends to be, non-college educated. You guys are already above the bar. You're college educated, right? But non-college educated because the economy is leaving them behind, and they're scared. In the 1950s, the 1960s, they could support a family on a non-college education, right? They could, if they got out of high school, they picked up a trade, they could. That's not possible anymore. And in fact, it's becoming even difficult to support a family on a college education these days, which is why you have dual income families, right? Just very, very difficult. And so the gains have not been distributed evenly, and it brought jarring changes to culture and identity, and people feel as if society is moving too fast. You guys aren't feeling it. You are the most liberal generation that we have seen. And what I mean by that is that you believe in rights for individuals. You're progressive. You think that there should be a floor, that people shouldn't suffer without health care. If you look at the polls, right? They just came out. I'm talking about Americans. Some of you are not Americans in here. But among Americans, it's one of the most liberal generations that we have seen. Right? So you have not gone through this jarring cultural context. We already talked about Roe v. Wade, where all of a sudden people were saying, but that's God's decision. The state doesn't have a right to tell doctors that they can do this now. And so people are pushing back, again, back to that backlash thing. And so if you look at people who support populists, it tends to be people with lower levels of education and lesser incomes. And they're feeling left behind. Not all the supporters, but the good chunk of them. So the political implications, it tends to be supported by less educated people. And they look back to a golden moment. Have you heard about these golden moments where the world was the best and the brightest? Where the United States, you walk down the lane and there's flowers, and you could take your kid and it was safe, and you could go get a milkshake and it didn't cost you $5, although a milkshake now is probably $7. But anyway, but where the small things in life were not luxuries, right? You could take your family away for a 1-week, 2-week vacation, that kind of thing. So there was this narrative about this golden moment, and that somehow that's been lost. And sadly, that what has ended up happening is that a lot of times it's hooked into war. So one of the things I really picked up when I was living in the UK, living through the Brexit vote, which sadly, again, your generation voted to stay. They wanted to be part of Europe. They wanted that freedom of movement across the English Channel and into Europe and not have to have passports and visas. But among the older and among people who are not as well educated, where do they harken back to for their memories? World War II. That was where Britain had its shining moment. If you read, anybody doing British literature in here? Anybody read Roald Dahl? Roald Dahl, a lot of World War II orphans, right? Roald Dahl writes a lot about orphans. This is the British experience, this is the British culture. My children, striped pajamas. Any of you read the striped pajamas? World War II. I'm trying to think of another novel. So just read British literature, modern British literature, and a lot of it harkens back to World War II and this glorious moment of armed conflict where Britain was great. It came together as a nation. Life was simple. We were united. Neighbor watched out for neighbor, right? And they're hearkening back to that. It was 70 years ago. Now this generation's dying out, but it lives long in the culture, in part through the literature. I mean, my children, I was like, oh my gosh, another orphan World War II novel that might have to, with my children reading this. And it really struck me that this is the British experience. Okay, so critical, and we can debate this. What's the bigger threat, populism or religious, particularly Islamic jihadism, which is the sort of the extreme version of religious ideas that are out there. They both stress the importance of ideas. So again, IR scholars, what do they think about? Power. And how is power defined typically? Size of economy and size of the population. They don't think about the power of ideas. And so in this seminar, what I'm trying to get you guys to think about is the power of these big ideas that emerge and they transform societies and they transform global politics. The Soviet Union collapsed because the idea of communism did not work. And when they put it into place, it didn't work. Right? And some people say, well, they just didn't do it correctly. Well, the problem is basic human nature, we already talked about Thomas Hobbes. Humans, well, I guess it depends upon which philosopher you follow. I mean, because I already talked about Rousseau. Rousseau was conflicted about whether humans were naturally sociable or not. He really is. Hobbes does not believe they're naturally sociable. That's why you need the Leviathan up there. Locke, I think Locke, for the most part, what do you think, Luke? I think Locke thought humans, because you have to make trade and transactions. Like Locke was a Mr. Trade guy, or Mr. Transaction, right, guy. So the big question is, these big ideas, and why communism failed as a system, is that humans don't want to put the basic idea of communism is everybody puts in, and you take out, what you need, right? And humans say, no, if I put in more, I should get more. That's a base, tends to be. Now, not all humans are ticked that way, but there seems to be a human nature for most humans that if you put in more, you should be, and then you can make a decision to be magnanimous, right? So you can still be magnanimous, but if I put in more effort, I'm going to resent you not putting as much effort and still getting as much. And so communism sort of tried to override that basic human feature, which is why it failed and was likely to fail. But in any event, so one of the questions is, which do you think is the bigger threat to international politics, security, and the global order? Populism, which is really, tossing out the existing system and what they see as corrupt elites. By the way, it's what they see as, the elites may not be corrupt. I think most politicians are trying to do the best job that they can. I do. I think that they are in public service. They're foregoing a lot. But somehow the system, and particularly in the United States, has become locked. All right, so if you think about the differences in similarity of populism, it rises within states, whereas Islamic jihadism in the current era, it's transnational. It goes across states. So you guys could write a paper about this. It would be a really fun paper. It's a nice idea for a paper. Populism tends to be supported by majorities, right? So large numbers of people have to support it in order to have sway. It may not be majorities, but it has to be large numbers of people that can sway a political system for it to take hold. And this is what happened in Italy. You have a populist government in Italy today. Whereas Islamic jihadism, it is a small minority, but man, they can do a lot of damage. But keep that in mind, it is only a very small minority of Muslims, right, Islamic, who abide by this. Interestingly, they both see corrupted elites and the system is the problem, and they want to overthrow it. right? Graham Wood, he's a journalist for The Atlantic, wrote a book on what does ISIS want? I think that's is that the title? I think that's the title of his book, What Does ISIS Want? And paradoxically, he said they want the same thing we do. They want open, transparent, accountable government. That's what they were trying to do, believe it or not. They were trying to create open, not necessarily fully open, but transparent and accountable government. They were trying to get rid of corruption, which they were seeing in Syria and Iraq and all that. In populists, they want to either change the system or bring it down. There are some, if you read Breitbart, you can read, every time they have a story, you can read that they're ready for the Civil War, some of them, depending upon the story. And I suggest you guys read as widely as you can. You read New York Times, Washington Post, Washington Times, Financial Times, Breitbart, what else? And then you can read all the journals, The Conservative, The Nation, The Atlantic, and read comment sections. That's really going to give you, it's hard to read some of these comments, especially for women sometimes. Some of these places are really misogynistic. But you want to get a temperature for how people are seeing things. And some on the populist side, particularly in the Breitbart, when you read those, they want to bring, it's not enough to change, they want to bring down the system. If you're a Democrat, you're a Demrat, you're a Librat. I mean, the language is crazy. And that's kind, by the way. They have much dirtier language than that. And then these guys want to bring down the system. They want to get rid of the Western order. They want to get rid of the secular order completely. Threat of the violence might be useful to these guys. Locked and loaded. How many times have I read, I'm locked and loaded, we're ready to go. And then here, violent action is necessary. That's what the jihad is, defending your neighbors. All right, so conclusion, populism and the rise of globally, I think they have very similar roots. I think this counter-reaction to the failure of the modern state and people being left behind. And in the case of religion, it's that the religious actors were actually doing it on the ground, and they were brought into the political system. In populist, different dynamic in the end, because they want to toss out the bad guys. And there's nobody there to replace it, which is how you end up with these very iconoclastic individuals. Right? So this is how you end up with a Trump, right? There's really no Republican Party left. The Republicans are really struggling because the Republican Party now is Trump. And because they want to toss out the whole system. And we'll see if the Republican Party can recover from this. And similarly, Brexit, you toss out the whole system. Liberal Democrats in Britain, they're dead. The Conservatives, Theresa May is having a really hard time. UKIP, Lafarge, what is his name? The guy, he was head of UKIP. He came into office to bring on Brexit. Once Brexit happened, he left. What is his name? I'll think of it in a little while. Does anybody? Farage, Nigel Farage, right? So you get these very iconoclastic individuals leading because the whole system is bad. So even the political parties aren't acceptable. And then we haven't talked about fascism. You probably are studying that in one of your history classes, very 1930s, 1940s. It's the most war-prone of all, and violence is, again, enemy of the folk, right? Enemy of the people. It's very nativist. So I'm studying that a little bit because I'm interested in white nativism. Where does that come from? Who is part of us? Who makes a true American, whatever that is? Well, anyway, but enemies that you go after that is necessary for legitimacy. So IR theory, it seemed to explain much of the dynamics of the Cold War. Look, there's no denying there were two powers, two poles, nuclear weapons, positioned against one another. But boy, did it miss a lot, right? It really missed a lot. And I think power, as we know it, is changing. It is changing. It may not just be people power and economic power, but I think one of the two challenges, I think, for the 21st century, and we might talk about, I think the rise of women. I think this is a real challenge. Kudos to you guys for being an all-women's college, right? But we are threatening to the male established order. There is patriarchy in the world, and it's a real threat in many corners of the world. I think the United States is more progressive. There are other places. The Scandinavian countries are finding the right balance. They really are. I think the United States, I hope it's moving in that direction. So I think that's going to be one of the critical challenges of your generation, is having true equality and still fighting for it. And the second one is, who's going to determine the truth? Given the digital technologies, the ability of ideas, news, stories, how do we know what's true? What about this most recent story of this kid and the Native American and the March on Washington? Whose story is who? There's stories. There's different narratives now. At first we had this very black and white, snarky kid up against a Native American, how dare he? And now we said, no, it's much more complicated than that. There were other actors in the scene and other things going on. It's very complicated. Whose reality will dominate? And how do we know we have the right videos, right? How do we know we have the whole story? We'll never have, it's interpretations of story. This is what's happening. Russia is the master of misinformation, right? Putin, he's a former intelligence guy, FSB, right? And they're creating realities that some Americans are buying, right? That they're accepting as real. And so I think the two challenges is women, the rise of women, which is a real threat to many, many corners of the world. And are we really going to be able to discern what is reality? It's, you know, what is fake news and what's not fake news? And so college education goes a long way to helping you to discern that. And I think that's it. All right, so discussion?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, so continue to have a discussion with Professor Toft. Continue to ask your questions.
Ask me any questions. You can ask me about my personal life too. We can do work-life balance stuff if you want, but we should probably start with this lecture. Yes? No? Yes?
I guess, so obviously the rise of populism in the United States has been correlated to some extent with kind of the rise of the religious elements in our country. To what extent do you see that also playing a role in the, I guess, populist movements happening in kind of Eastern Europe at the moment?
Mm-hmm. Well, I wouldn't necessarily say the United States, even that it's the rise of religion leads to the rise of populism. There is a correlation, you're right. I think the movement is actually quite distinct. And in Europe, I think, again, it's that the states, just like in the United States, the governmental institutions are not functioning to deliver to everybody, and there are people being left behind. So just like in the United States, there are people being left behind. So if you look at sort of in the last election, not the primaries, but the presidential election, Trump supporters, Trump was overwhelmingly supported in districts that are suffering from the opioid addiction crisis. You know about this, right? It's a real crisis in our country. It's actually not just in our country. Europe has also got its own opioid crisis. Because again, they feel as if they're being left behind. And so Trump is an outsider. He represents the voice of the people. You know, some people believe that he misspells on purpose on his Twitter account, right? Because he's trying to appeal to the common man, to the people. And the same kind of dynamic is happening in Europe, where you have these gregarious, sort of loud, if you're, I don't know, sophisticated, you'd say uncouth, kind of personalities dominating the political scene and managing to sway enough of the population to support them. And so I do see sort of similar dynamics happening both in Europe. Hungary, Viktor Orban, he's consolidating power. In Turkey, Erdogan, consolidate as an individual. I mean, it's one person trying to consolidate power. And there does seem to be a sense with President Trump, there was a really enlightening moment during the debate where he berated candidate Hillary Clinton, alma mater here, candidate Hillary Clinton for not effecting enough change, as if she as an individual, do you remember that in the debate? Where he says, well, you've been in office for 19 years. Why haven't you made any change? And his sense is, I really think this is a personal sense, but it's also very populist, right? Sense is that you should have been able to do that, not understanding how government works. And the best definition of government that I've seen is government works best when it's invisible, right? When it's invisible. And you don't see it. The roads are just taken care of, the fire department responds, the military is defending the borders when there's not crisis. So our government right now, is it invisible? No, it's completely ineffectual right now. All right, it's shut down. And one of our defense, the Coast Guard, it's pretty unnerving. Our Coast Guard right now, which does a lot of defense of our borders because it's under the rubric of Homeland Security, is not being paid. And so one of our arms, the branches of the Defense Department or branches of defense, not in the Defense Department, is not even being paid, but they're expecting to guard the borders. And so, so people are looking around the world and they're looking at ineffectual governments and there is lots of corruption and fat and inefficiencies, and it's such a strong reaction that you get where we just want to toss out the whole system and change the whole system. You saw that in Britain. This is what the Brexit vote was about. It was about two things. One is the population did not feel as if the EU was representative of them. It wasn't democratic. Most Brits couldn't name their Minister of Parliament in the EU. And the second is controlling immigration. This cultural argument about we don't want to change. We want to be British, however that's defined. And if anybody been to London, right? It's one of the most intermixed international cities I've ever been in, right? But they're chiming back to a time when it was sort of a white, British, English, and it was actually, Brexit was largely an English vote, right? So Great Britain, you've got Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and England. Scotland voted to stay. Wales voted to stay. Northern Ireland voted to stay. It was England that sort of pulled it out. And the English have a very sort of romantic, the people who voted for this, it wasn't the English, but the people who voted for Brexit have a very romantic idea of what it means to be English. And they feel as if the modern contemporary political system in England, in Britain, is not representing them, and they need to get out. And that and actually the EU is not representing them, and that these immigrants are part of the problem. That they're stealing one of the reasons why I'm not getting ahead is these immigrants are stealing my job, right? And you see that again in Hungary. Hungary is interesting because why it's been even more extreme in a sense in the reaction and more accepting of Orban. Basically, he's becoming a dictator, right? He's stripping the judiciary of its authority, so there's not checks on that. The parliament is becoming a rubber stamp. Similarly in Turkey under Erdogan, it's really unnerving that this is happening. But in Turkey, some scholars make the argument is that because it was part of the Soviet Union and closed to immigration, that when the crisis in Syria happened, it was such a shock of having so many outsiders come in at once.
And what about Brazil, which to my knowledge hasn't been experiencing immigration the same way as this?
Yeah, well, what?
Bolsonaro.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
What are my thoughts? I think it's the failure of the state and the corrupt system. And people are just done. And so that what they do is, it's like a rubber, is it a rubber band? What is it, you back and forth, right? And
after Dilma Rousseff, they wanted someone who wouldn't go to jail.
Yeah, no. So it's really, again, it's back to this corrupt elite. And in Britain, it's the corrupt EU. It's not democratic, doesn't represent us, and then the immigrants. But in Brazil and in Latin America, we're probably going to see more of these populist-style candidates. Duterte in the Philippines. The guy is actually, just basically doing martial law. He's killing whoever without any impunity. If you are declared to have been a drug user or a drug dealer, they're just killing, summary execution of people. And again, people are willing to accept this because the crime rate was high, drug use was high, but then until it becomes your brother or your sister, and you're like, wow, maybe we shouldn't accept, we need more checks, we need more accountability on the government. So yeah, and what is your name again? Maya.
I have a bunch of questions.
Sure.
I guess I'll start with so in a lot of cases, I forget which groups specifically, but I know that groups in Afghanistan and definitely groups in Colombia, like FARC, that are both sort of insurgency groups, terrorist groups-ish, but also have like a huge hand in a lot of drug trade, like heroin coming out of Afghanistan and cocaine coming out of Colombia and Peru. But you know, those groups also provide like a lot of humanitarian, or not humanitarian is the wrong word, but social services. Like FARC was really, really instrumental in like paying peasants so that they wouldn't starve, and like obviously offering like huge monetary incentives for growing coca leaves, which really helped a lot of people. So like, what do you think the best way to deal with those kinds of groups that provide, that sort of fill the gaps that the government can't, but also are, you know, participating in a lot of this like really violent like drug trade and other kinds of illegal activity?
Yeah, no, and it's quite common for these rebel organizations, these insurgencies, to do this because this is what ISIS did. ISIS built a state, and you know, sadly, tragically, the local population has to play along because there's no other sort of employer in town. They control the currency, they control trade, they control the jobs. There was a great series of New York Times reports about disposition of titles of land. I mean, ISIS even had a land distribution department. I mean, and giving out titles to land. It's in the New York Times. Luke, remind me to can you say the articles? It's by a particular young woman who found a tranche of files about this land policy of ISIS. And I can, in fact, I can introduce you to her. Her name eludes me right now.
Is this the same reporter who did Caliphate, like the podcast?
I think it might be. She's
Okay,
New York
yeah.
Times.
I
Yeah.
remember,
Yeah, she's brilliant. Well, anyway, so I think it was her. She told me the story. It was her last day in Iraq or Syria. I can't remember which part it was, and they ended up coming upon this house, and they just found boxes upon boxes of formal ISIS paperwork about. So one part of my answer to your question is that why people go along and do this is there's no alternative, right? There's no alternative state, that the state's been supplanted by these organizations. How you get around it is you've got to try to rebuild states that are more responsible, more receptive, and it's back to aid, right? So this is what the United States has been trying to do in Afghanistan, not succeeding, in part because in order to do it, we would need much more money and much more commitment. And I'm not sure we have the stomach for it at this point. Afghanistan is our longest war. And then in Iraq, you've got now the complication of Syria and ISIS, and now you've got Russia and Iran. I mean, it's become a much more difficult situation in the Middle East because you've got the Russians and the Iranians on one side, and then the Americans and its coalition on the other side, the Saudis sort of mucking around, and now Yemen. And so the United States would have liked to have built, you know, a bona fide state in Iraq and tried. We put billions of dollars, trillions of dollars into this effort, into the war itself and then the after. But that's how you get around it, Maya, is you try to build state structures and alternative lifestyles. So in Afghanistan, alternatives to opium. In Colombia, alternatives to coca, right? Or, you know, some people say, well, you buy up the coca, but then that'll drive prices up and it'll just shift the problem somewhere else. So it's a really, really difficult problem, trying to move in and build states where there weren't states. And, you know, this is the PLO. I mean, one of the reasons why the PLO is supported as much as it is that it's actually providing state services, right? It is the main provider. It is a state within a state. The what?
Hamas is like one of the best healthcare providers, I think, in the world.
Yeah, women educated in Palestinian women are some of the best educated women in the world. They're very good about education, and so you know, there's, you know, that's what insurgencies, what these kinds of organizations do, and then people in war zones, they have to go along because there's no alternative, and they're afraid they're going to get killed. And I mean, ISIS had a recruit. There was just a piece in yesterday's New York Times about a scientist that ISIS recruited to help them build chemical weapons. He had no choice. They know who his family is, and they target his family, and it's very difficult. And it's hard for outsiders. If the state itself, the indigenous state, can't build it, and we got out of the colonial business, you know, the United States wasn't really a colonial power. We were expansive power, expanding power, and took over lots and lots of lands from Native Americans. But the Europeans got out of colonialism in the 50s and the 60s, and they don't want to go back. And they can't go back in part because other states or other people in other states don't want to be recolonized or turned in. People are talking about protectorates. Can we become a protectorate? And you know, half the population thinks that might be a good idea, and the other half population, no, that's just new modern day colonialism. So it's very, very difficult. Let me go to somebody else, and then we can come back to you. And what's your name?
I'm Virginia.
Okay.
This is sort of a rambly question.
That's
because
fine.
I'm not sure what my question is.
That's fine.
But in the circumstance of the Chinese state systemically torturing Falun Gong and harvesting their organs, I'm wondering why that isn't something that's more well known or talked about, and I'm wondering if it's a result of the relative obscurity of the religion, or a result of the fact that it's sort of an atheist war on this religion, or if we as Americans are less likely to involve ourselves in matters that, because I remember you talking about the near versus the far sort of, what was the
Enemy, near enemy versus the far
yeah,
enemy.
and I guess it's more of a near enemy for them. So is that, I wonder if that's a reason why we don't really.
Well, there's this thing called sovereignty that states have. So two things. First of all, China is a great power, right? A major power, at least, if not a great power. And great powers tend not to get involved in the affairs of other great powers. So when you think, have you guys learned about responsibility to protect doctrine? Okay, so responsibility to protect doctrine came about in the 1990s because there were a lot of states, sort of to Maya's point, there were a lot of states that were really failing, and in some cases actually predating on their populations, actually, you know, killing off their populations or cleansing them or committing genocide. And so they came up with this theory of responsibility to protect, right? And the initials of it are called R2P. You'll see this if any of you do IR or international law. Right? So responsibility to protect doctrine. And why this is such a big deal is that if you look at the United Nations Charter, right, all states are sovereign and equal and have the right to non-intervention, meaning that other states do not have the right to intervene in their affairs. That's laid out in the UN Charter, right? You cannot go into the affairs of other states. Hold on a second, let me just finish this thought. So R2P, so that held sway to at least the 1990s, from 1945 to so 45 years. This is codified. Sovereign equality among states. So Singapore is as equal as the United States, and the right to non-intervention. R2P comes along, responsibility to protect doctrine, and responsibility to protect says, no, if a state has an obligation to minimally not harm its citizens, but actually should be taking care of its citizens. And other states, therefore, have a right to get involved and get engaged. And the first case, and the cases that really got this going was the genocide, the 1993 genocide in Rwanda, or 1994 genocide in Rwanda, which was horrific, right? We don't even know, anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million people were killed. With machetes, by the way. Do you know how difficult it is to kill somebody with a machete? Takes effort, right? That was horrific. So 1994 that happens, and there was some other case, Kosovo in 1999. But the first case that really invoked this was Libya, where the French really dragged the United States in. The United States did not want to get in. Obama was very hesitant, and they said there was imminent danger to the population in Libya. We need to invoke responsibility to protect, right? So you go to the UN Security Council and you get a resolution and you go in. It was a failure, actually. We saw what happened in Libya. We had civil war now, and we still have civil war. And so to answer your question, states have a tendency, so large powers love responsibility to protect. Small powers don't. Why do you think that is? Yeah, Maya.
When large powers go in and help, they can, help the people that they want, that they know will be sympathetic to their cause at the end of the day.
Yeah. So large powers can go where they want. Small powers have to accept what comes their way. So small states actually love the UN Charter. It gives them sovereign equality. You can be a tiny little Vanuatu that's disappearing, right? But you can be Vanuatu and you have the same rights and privileges, right? But obligations. So when this doctrine was being expounded, it was Canadians that really pushed it with Kofi Annan. They really, really pushed it. Small states didn't like it because they thought, oh my God, here comes China, here comes the United States, here comes France, here comes Britain. They're going to be intervening in our affairs, right? Because they don't want that. And so one of the reasons why the United States, so then there are certain administrations in the United States. The United States has 4 table legs, used to. It's changing under Trump. We're in a new era here, where if you think about US foreign policy, right? There's traditionally 4 things. We love free trade, right? And open markets, right? So we work really hard to keep that going, right? We like free trade. The other thing we want is non-proliferation, right? So we go around the world, this is North Korea, this is Iran. We do not like nuclear weapons, right? So US foreign policy, we really focus in on that. And the Trump administration is keeping that going. It's trying to keep this going. It thinks that China, right now we're in a trade war with China, that China's not being fair. Non-proliferation, this is Iran, North Korea. The next is regional hegemons, right? We don't like regional hegemons. Do you guys know what a regional hegemon is?
India?
Yeah, India is a regional hegemon. It's another one.
China, kind of.
China is.
China.
So the big question is China a regional or is it global? Right? We're nervous about China because China is now in Africa. It's got expansive. It's expansive all through the Middle East, through Asia, but it's moving into Africa, right? We don't like regional hegemons, so we work really hard to knock back regional hegemons. So when Iraq went into Kuwait in 1990, one of the reasons why we went there was we did not want Iraq controlling Kuwait because it would have tilted the balance in the Middle East toward Iraq against Iran. We liked Iran and Iraq fighting with each other. We like India and Pakistan duking it out. That's in our interest, right? And we play them off on each other, and we just hope there's no big war. Yeah, well, it's hard, right? But in any event, but now it's this is becoming a challenge, and we don't know where these guys are. And then the last one is what? The United States has always stood for this, although we were hypocrites about it.
Democracy.
Democracy and human rights. I would say human rights, right? We are defenders of human rights. The country was founded on that. We have a Bill of Rights, right? Our U.S. Constitution, right? And the Declaration of Independence, we want representation, right? Taxation, no taxation without representation was all. So human rights. It has been part of the United States. This is sort of what separates the United States from a lot of countries around the world, is that we really believe in the rights of individuals. And we will stick up for them. Now, we'll be hypocritical because we have other interests, right? These are our interests. And we'll abrogate this in order to secure that sometimes. We've done that. We are a hypocritical country. We will do that. But we will say it's because these interests are so much more important that this leader here, we need to knock them out, Saddam Hussein, right? So human rights. So what's really striking is China could give 2 licks. It does not care about human rights. It just doesn't. It doesn't. It's not part of its foreign policy makeup. Britain joins us on this, and France to some extent, right? But this is really what separates the United States. You could even say the liberal order, Western order, if you think that this is it. And perhaps Germany, although Germany, and I'll put Japan here, why are they hesitant? Here? They're hesitant because of World War II. They're still guilty. They're still paying for World War II. So they're not as engaged on this issue as these countries are, right? So China doesn't care. So what's interesting about the Trump administration is they don't seem to care either. Human rights is not part of this administration's. It was part of Bush's and a part of Obama's. Obama actually, he had Samantha Power in the government, and she was the one that was pushing genocide, massacres against civilians. That was her issue. She wrote a Pulitzer Prize winning book about the genocide in Rwanda. George W. Bush Jr., this was part of his makeup. right? This is why, in part, he went into the Middle East. Although, what was the first reason that they said that they went in? It was this: Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. This was it, right? And then they said, oh, but he's also a really nasty guy. We need to take him out. So to a really long answer to your question is we're at a point where you've got to think about the different interests of states, what they're trying to advance, right? And human rights, there has to be absolutely gross, flagrant, huge violations of human rights in order for a state to say, we're going to override these other concerns to take care of these concerns. And chances are it's not going to involve a state of this size and this, it's why we were able to, we should have gone into Rwanda. And we didn't. We didn't, right? And so when Kosovo happened, right, the United States got involved because it didn't want another Rwanda on its hands. And actually, Kosovo was it was fairly successful, although Milosevic did manage to clear them out, but then they moved back. Casey, right?
Yes. Yeah, just staying within the Middle Kingdom for a little bit. I know that, so there's been a resurgence in kind of Christianity in China over the past couple of years, I guess. And I recently read that there were, I guess, like Christian communist activists almost that were kind of protesting the government.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering whether or not, in light of this kind of upsurgence in religion in China, whether or not you think that the policy of the Chinese government, which has been, to a certain extent very autocratic, especially under the current president, is going to continue to tolerate kind of religious dissenters within their ranks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think they will. It's as long as they don't become. So one of the things that makes them nervous about Falun Gong, Virginia, is they're a big organization. They have a lot of followers, and they don't. The Communist Party is the head honcho, and they don't want any other sources of authority in the country. It's why they will not allow the Catholic Church. They'll allow Catholicism, but they won't let the Catholic Church, right? They'll allow Christianity, but not organized form of religion. And so the question is how big they come, what are the lines of authority, right? And if they become too big, guess what? You'll start seeing more repression and crackdown. So I think they'll allow it to a point where it tips, because it's good to allow the people to have some outlets. One of the things that China's done very well, it's learned from the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was cracking down on a lot of different stuff, trying to, Gorbachev was not trying to get rid of the Communist Party. He was not. What he was trying to make was a nicer Communist Party and a more responsive Communist Party, which is what China has done, right? But now what's interesting in China is that these movements are saying, but we're a more authentic, true Communist Party.
Yeah.
So the question is, will they become a threat to the Communist Party, or, and they might, well, in all likelihood, if you watch these things, the Communist Party will adopt their tactics and sort of undermine, by taking them on, undermine them, and so that.
Wouldn't that require them to kind of go against the quasi-market system that they've so successfully adopted?
Yeah, but there's ways to finesse it. You can just say it's still communal property, and that we're going to make sure that everybody has a floor.
Just bigger special economic zones?
Yeah, something like that. I mean, there's ways to finesse it. So, but for now, it's not a big enough threat, but it could be. And so what the first thing they'll do is I think they'll try to, this is just my sense of reading lots of different histories about, is they'll try to commandeer the ideas and some of the institutes, and then they'll knock the knees out of the leadership and put them in jail as being subversives and traitors and that kind of thing. So I think it's Melanie, right? Mandy, okay.
Yeah. So about Falun Gong in China, I feel like what the Chinese government have used to take it down was what happened in Tiananmen Square back in 2001, where a couple of allegedly Falun Gong people burned themselves in front of a crowd, and I feel like Chinese using that example to say oh, Falun Gong is getting super big, so it's influencing the social stability, and they will not allow it.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it's necessarily atheist. It's just they don't want any religion to get way too popular.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah, so I don't think the ideas really matter. I think it's the size of the organization. Is it a threat to the Communist Party? That's what they care about. They care about two things. China. You tell me if I'm wrong. If you want to continue our conversation. One is maintaining the Communist Party as the preeminent locus of power, right? That's number one. And number two is keeping the economy humming, because they have a big middle class now, and they need to compete, economically to keep that middle class happy. And so long as one of those is threatened, then you're going to see a more autocratic system come into play. So Falun Gong, I agree with you, Mandy, that it doesn't matter that they could be, I don't know, they could be Confucius. But if they're trying to, this whole harmony movement under Xi, right? They want harmony and all of that. If it becomes an alternative focus of authority, that's when it starts becoming a threat. So you had another point?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So like last year, like around December, like China had like detention camps for like Muslims in like our Xinjiang province, and I wonder if that like might be related to like what the like Islamic like violence happening in the Middle East, because like China is not like targeting like any other religious group, but like it's like only targeting the Muslims, and it's like there are huge camps, so like people in China don't know about it.
No, it's astonishing, and they don't know about it in the West. Something like 1 in 10 Muslims is imprisoned in China. And one of the reasons is, I'm going to give you one of my fantastic maps, right? But one of the reasons, so this is China, right? But one of the reasons is that the minorities are in the border areas, and that's a threat. If they were right here in the middle, right, China could really control the borders and control movements in and out. But the fact that you've got the Hui and the Uyghur on the peripheries, right, and they're Muslim, which means they have alternative authority. I just went through, it's an alternative source of authority for these people. It's a threat. And what's really astonishing about China as a student, as somebody who's been studying ethnicity and nationalism and self-determination now for 30 years, is that it's 95% Han. I mean, it's not like the Han Chinese are a minority in their own country. It's really astonishing, but they're very threatened about these minorities in the Western periphery because, of course, it's a big, expansive state. And we've been hearing a lot about borders. They want to be able to control the borders and movement in and out. And if these populations, they're afraid they're going to be a fourth column of disruption and upset. And so what you do see is a lot of where Shanghai is up here, right? Beijing is down here. Is that you have China, the state, having people move, Han Chinese move into those areas, and it's creating conflict. We call them sons of soil conflicts, right? Sons of soil. Son of soil, or sons of soil conflicts, is that the native populations, the autochthonous they're called, native populations, they're getting displaced by land, jobs, and everything else. But this is typical of states. Empires used to do this a lot. They would move, in order to control. And it's because China is very concerned about these minority populations, which are very small, but it's the location of those populations that's a threat to the state. And the fact that they're not Han, and that they're Muslim. Any other questions? Okay, we finish at 3? Is that right, Luke?
Yeah, unless there's more questions.
Any
we
other
continue
questions?
this
Yeah.
discussion now.
Did you guys enjoy this? Yes? Feel free to email me. And if any seniors, did I hear any seniors in here? Oh, you. Yeah, if you want any advice or places to go, like next colleges, actually next university, you're in college, email me. I always like giving advice. I don't mind talking to people, and I've been at a number of really fine institutions for graduate school. And if you want to go get a PhD, Ms. Classicist, my first conversation was, don't do it. It's really hard. It's a long haul, especially in classics, because you have to master at least 3 languages, I think, right?
And you need to wait for someone to die before you can get it.
Yeah, the job. Don't even talk to me about the job market. It's terrible. No, I have this center that I run, and I'm a huge fan of historians, even though I'm trained as a political scientist. And I think classics has history beat, but the history market is just dreadful. And so I try and boost my historian, try and keep getting them funding so that they can get more publications out so they can get jobs, and it's just dire. So I'm so glad you're thinking along those lines, but on the other hand, we do need somebody to keep teaching these things. So, oh well. All right. Well, thank you for having me, and enjoy your time. This is an amazing series that you guys can take part in. And Luke, thank you for having me.